From the day I was born, I was destined for a life of luxury. As Ava Sinclair, the only daughter of real estate tycoon Robert Sinclair, I grew up in a world where diamond-encrusted watches were as common as plastic ones, and five-star hotels felt more like home than our sprawling Manhattan penthouse. My childhood was a whirlwind of private jets, exclusive galas, and vacations in places most people only dream of visiting. Dad always had a way of making his point clear, and one of his favorite mantras was, "Love doesn't pay the bills, Ava." He'd say it with a smirk, swirling his expensive scotch in a crystal glass, as if to emphasize that success only came with a hefty price tag. I remember countless dinners where he'd lecture me about the importance of marrying into the right family, someone who could add value to our empire. It was exhausting, but I didn't know any different. My world revolved around designer clothes, charity events, more for show than actual charity, and rubbing elbows with New York's elite. I dated guys my father approved of, sons of other tycoons, up-and-coming Wall Street hotshots, and even a young senator once. But something always felt off, like I was playing a role in a movie I didn't audition for. It wasn't until my 25th birthday that I decided I needed a break. On a whim, I booked a trip to a small town in Virginia, far from the skyscrapers and constant buzz of the city. I told Dad it was a spiritual retreat to appease him, but in reality, I just wanted to breathe without feeling the weight of expectations on my shoulders. That's where I met Ethan. God, thinking back to that moment still makes my heart skip a beat. I was trying, and failing, to navigate my way through a corn maze on the outskirts of town when I quite literally ran into him. One minute I was cursing my designer boots for sinking into the mud, and the next, I was staring into the warmest brown eyes I'd ever seen. "Whoa there, city slicker," he said with a chuckle, steadying me with strong, calloused hands. "You look a bit lost." I should have been offended by the nickname, but something in his easy smile made me laugh instead. That obvious, huh? Ethan, as I soon learned, was born and raised in that very town. He worked on his family's farm, tending to crops and livestock with a passion I'd never seen before. Over the next few days, he became my unofficial tour guide, showing me a world so different from my own that it felt like I'd stepped onto another planet. We watched sunsets from the back of his beat-up pickup truck, the sky a canvas of oranges and pinks that no designer could ever replicate. He taught me how to milk a cow, a disaster that ended with both of us covered in milk but laughing so hard our sides hurt. We went fishing in a quiet lake, where the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water and our soft conversation. For the first time in my life, I felt seen for who I was, not for my last name or my bank account. Ethan didn't care about the brand of my clothes or how many zeros were in my trust fund. He cared about my thoughts, my dreams, the little quirks that made me, well, me. As my retreat came to an end, I realized I wasn't ready to leave. The thought of going back to New York, to the endless parties and shallow conversations, made my stomach churn. So, I did something I'd never done before. I extended my stay, much to my father's dismay. "Ava, darling," he said over the phone, his voice dripping with barely concealed annoyance, "you have responsibilities here. The Vanderbilt Gala is next week, and we need to discuss your role in the new development project." I took a deep breath, looking out the window of my rented cottage to where Ethan was chopping wood, a sight that never got old. "I'm not coming back yet, Dad. I need more time." The silence on the other end was deafening. When he spoke again, his voice was cold. "Is this about a boy? Please tell me you haven't fallen for some country bumpkin." His words stung, but they also ignited a fire in me I didn't know existed. "His name is Ethan," I said firmly, "and he's shown me more about life and love in a few weeks than I've learned in 25 years in your world." The argument that followed was explosive. Dad threatened to cut me off, to take away my trust fund, my car, everything. But for once, the thought of losing all that didn't scare me. What scared me was the idea of losing Ethan, of going back to a life that now felt hollow and meaningless. Over the next few months, Ethan and I grew closer. I learned to appreciate the simple things, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, the taste of fresh vegetables we'd grown ourselves, the joy of a community that genuinely cared for each other. Ethan taught me about resilience, about finding beauty in imperfection, and about loving unconditionally. When he proposed on a crisp autumn evening, surrounded by the golden hues of changing leaves, I didn't hesitate. The ring was simple, a small diamond set in a band of rose gold, nothing like the flashy rocks I was used to seeing. But to me, it was the most beautiful piece of jewelry I'd ever owned because it represented something real. Telling my father about the engagement was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I flew back to New York, determined to face him in person. The moment I walked into his office, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. "So," he said, not even looking up from his computer, "you've finally come to your senses." I took a deep breath, twisting the engagement ring on my finger. "Actually, Dad, I'm here to tell you that I'm getting married. To Ethan." The silence that followed was deafening. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were cold, calculating. "You can't be serious, Ava. This is just a phase, a rebellion. You'll get over it." But I stood my ground. I told him about the life Ethan and I wanted to build together, about the values we shared, about the love we had for each other. With each word, I could see my father's face hardening, his disapproval radiating off him in waves. "He doesn't belong in our world, Ava," he spat out, rising from his chair. "He'll drag you down. Is that what you want? To throw away everything I've built for you?" His words hurt, but they also strengthened my resolve. "No, Dad. What I want is to be happy. And Ethan makes me happier than I've ever been." The weeks leading up to the wedding were tense. Dad reluctantly agreed to attend the ceremony, but I knew he didn't approve. The night before the wedding, as I sat in my childhood bedroom surrounded by boxes, I was moving out for good. I felt a mix of excitement and sadness. I was gaining a new life, a chance at real happiness, but I was also losing the only family I'd ever known. Ethan called me that night, his voice a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. "You okay, sunshine?" he asked, using the nickname he'd given me on our first date. I smiled, feeling the tension leave my body. "I am now. I wish things were different with my dad." "I know," he said softly. "But remember, we're in this together. No matter what happens tomorrow, I've got your back." As I hung up, I looked at the photo of Ethan and me on my nightstand. It was a candid shot, taken during a county fair. We were both laughing, covered in powdered sugar from the funnel cakes we'd been eating. In that moment, I knew I was making the right choice. Choosing the man I loved meant rejecting a legacy that had never brought me true happiness, but it also meant embracing a future full of possibility and genuine joy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, I allowed myself to dream of the life Ethan and I would build together, a life rich not in material wealth, but in love, laughter, and the kind of happiness money could never buy. The morning of my wedding dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I stood at the window of the quaint bed and breakfast where I'd spent the night, watching the sun rise over the rolling Virginia hills. In just a few hours, I'd be Mrs. Ava Thompson. The thought sent a thrill through me, quickly followed by a pang of anxiety. My father was coming, and I had no idea what to expect. My best friend and maid of honor, Sarah, bustled into the room, her arms full of garment bags and makeup cases. "All right, bride-to-be," she chirped, her enthusiasm infectious. "Let's make you even more beautiful than you already are." As Sarah worked her magic, transforming my usually sleek city girl look into something softer, more romantic, we chatted about everything and nothing. It was a welcome distraction from the knot of worry in my stomach. "Have you heard from your dad?" Sarah asked cautiously as she pinned up my hair. I sighed, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "He texted last night. Said he'd be here." Sarah squeezed my shoulder. "That's good, right?" I wasn't so sure. Part of me wished he'd decided not to come. At least then I wouldn't have to worry about what he might do or say. The hours flew by in a flurry of hairspray, mascara, and nervous laughter. Before I knew it, I was standing at the entrance to the small chapel we'd chosen for the ceremony. It was a far cry from the lavish cathedral wedding my father had always envisioned for me, but as I looked at the wildflowers decorating the pews and smelled the fresh country air, I knew it was perfect. I peeked inside, my heart swelling at the sight of our guests. There were faces I recognized from New York, old school friends who'd supported my decision, a few cousins who'd braved my father's disapproval to attend. But the majority were Ethan's people, warm, down-to-earth folks who'd welcomed me with open arms. And there, at the front, stood Ethan, looking impossibly handsome in his suit. Our eyes met, and he gave me a wink that made my knees weak. Then I saw him. My father, sitting stiffly in the front row, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual attire of those around him. His face was set in a grim line, and I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't the look of a man who'd come to terms with his daughter's choices. The music started, and it was time. I took a deep breath, clutching my bouquet of wildflowers, and began my walk down the aisle. I focused on Ethan, on his smile that seemed to light up the entire chapel. With each step, I felt more certain. This was right. This was where I belonged. I reached the altar, handing my bouquet to Sarah before turning to face Ethan. He took my hands in his, and I felt the familiar calluses, the strength and gentleness that I'd come to associate with home. The officiant, a kindly old man from Ethan's church, began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," he intoned, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ethan Thompson and Ava Sinclair in holy matrimony." I was so lost in Ethan's eyes, in the promise of our future together, that I almost missed it. The scrape of a chair, the rustle of expensive fabric. Then, a voice that cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife. "If you marry this nobody," my father's voice boomed, "you can forget about your inheritance. Not 1 cent. The chapel fell silent. I felt Ethan's hands tighten around mine, a silent show of support. Slowly, I turned to face my father. He stood in the aisle, his face red with anger or perhaps embarrassment. The other guests looked on in shock, a few murmuring in disapproval. "Robert," Ethan's mother hissed from her seat, "this is not the time or place." But my father was on a roll. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" he continued, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "Mansions, sports cars, a fortune most people can't even imagine. And for what? To live on a farm? To get your hands dirty for a living?" I saw Ethan's jaw clench, saw the flash of hurt in his eyes. For a moment, I was transported back to my old life, feeling small and powerless in the face of my father's expectations. But then I looked at Ethan, at the life we'd built together, and I found my voice. "Okay," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I don't need your money." The silence that followed was deafening. I met my father's gaze, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise. Respect. I couldn't be sure. "Ava," he started, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Don't be foolish. You don't know what you're saying." I felt Ethan squeeze my hand, and I drew strength from his touch. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Dad. I choose love. I choose happiness. I choose Ethan." A murmur went through the crowd. I saw smiles on the faces of Ethan's family and friends, nods of approval from even some of the New York contingent. My father stood there, seemingly at a loss for words. The officiant cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" I turned back to Ethan, my heart pounding but my resolve stronger than ever. "Yes," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's continue." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. I was vaguely aware of my father sitting back down, of the words being spoken, of the rings being exchanged. But mostly, I was lost in Ethan's eyes, in the love and pride I saw reflected there. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the chapel erupted in cheers. Ethan pulled me close, his kiss a promise of all the adventures to come. As we turned to face our guests, I caught sight of my father. He sat alone, looking smaller somehow, the fight gone out of him. The reception was a joyous affair, held in a beautifully decorated barn on Ethan's family property. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, the scent of barbecue and fresh-baked pies filled the air, and the sound of laughter and good-natured teasing echoed off the wooden beams. I danced with Ethan, with his father, with our friends. But there was one dance missing, and despite everything, I felt its absence keenly. As the night wore on, I spotted my father standing awkwardly by the bar, nursing a glass of what I assumed was very expensive scotch. Taking a deep breath, I made my way over to him. "Dad," I said softly. He turned, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man who used to read me bedtime stories and chase away the monsters under my bed. "Ava," he replied, his voice gruff. I'm sorry about earlier. I shouldn't have. I held up a hand, stopping him. No, you shouldn't have. But what's done is done. I paused, gathering my courage. I know you don't understand my choices, Dad. But this is my life, and Ethan, he makes me happy. Truly happy. My father was quiet for a long moment, swirling the scotch in his glass. Finally, he looked up at me, and I was surprised to see a sheen of tears in his eyes. You look beautiful, he said softly. Just like your mother on our wedding day. The mention of my mother, who'd passed away when I was young, caught me off guard. I felt my own eyes well up with tears. Dance with me? I asked, holding out my hand. He hesitated for a moment, then set down his glass and took my hand. As we swayed to the soft music, I felt some of the tension between us begin to ease. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. The rest of the night passed in a whirlwind of cake cutting, toasts, and more dancing. As Ethan and I prepared to leave, showered with rice and well wishes, I caught sight of my father one last time. He stood apart from the crowd, but there was a small smile on his face. He gave me a nod, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Ethan helped me into his old pickup truck, now decorated with streamers and a just married sign. As we drove away, the sounds of the reception fading behind us, I leaned my head on his shoulder. You okay? He asked, kissing the top of my head. I thought about the day, the drama, the joy, the unexpected moments of grace. Yeah, I said, smiling up at him. I'm perfect. As we drove towards our new life together, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead might not be easy, but with Ethan by my side, I was ready for whatever came our way. The honeymoon phase of our marriage was anything but typical. Instead of jetting off to some exotic location, Ethan and I dove headfirst into our new life together on his family's farm. The morning after our wedding, I woke up to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of fresh coffee brewing. For a moment, I was disoriented, expecting to hear the honking of New York taxis or the ping of my phone with urgent work emails. But then I felt Ethan's warm body next to mine, and reality settled in. This was home now. Morning, sunshine, Ethan mumbled, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Ready for your first day as a farmer's wife? I couldn't help but laugh. As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. What's first on the agenda? As it turned out, first on the agenda was feeding the chickens. I stood in the coop, surrounded by cackling hens, holding a bucket of feed and feeling completely out of my element. Ethan showed me how to scatter the feed, his patience never wavering as I squealed every time a chicken came too close. They're not going to hurt you, Ava, he chuckled, gently guiding my hand to pet one of the friendlier hens. See? They're just hungry. Over the next few weeks, I learned more than I ever thought possible about farm life. Ethan taught me how to milk cows, a process that left me sore and slightly traumatized, how to plant and tend to various vegetables, and even how to drive a tractor, which, I must admit, was kind of fun once I got the hang of it. But it wasn't all romantic farm adventures. The reality of our new life hit me hard sometimes. I missed my designer clothes, my spa days, the ease of ordering takeout when I was too tired to cook. The work was physically demanding in a way I'd never experienced before. My soft hands became calloused, my neatly manicured nails were constantly caked with dirt, and I discovered muscles I didn't even know I had. One particularly challenging day, about a month into our marriage, I found myself sitting on the porch steps, fighting back tears of frustration. I'd spent hours trying to weed the vegetable garden, only to realize I'd pulled up half of the young carrot plants along with the weeds. Ethan found me there, my hands dirty and my spirit deflated. Hey, he said softly, sitting down beside me. Tough day. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without bursting into tears. Ethan wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close. You know, he said after a moment, when I was little, I used to hate helping in the garden. I'd complain to my grandpa every time he asked me to help with weeding or planting. You know what he told me? I shook my head, curious despite my misery. He said, Ethan, boy, everything worth doing is hard at first. But if you stick with it, one day you'll look out at these fields and feel a pride you can't get from anything else. And you know what? He was right. I looked out at the fields stretching before us, golden in the late afternoon sun. Does it ever get easier? I asked. Ethan smiled. Some things do. Others, well, they stay hard, but you get stronger. And that's even better. His words stayed with me, becoming a sort of mantra as I faced each new challenge. And there were plenty of challenges. Like the time I had to help birth a calf in the middle of the night, up to my elbows in, well, let's just say it wasn't a glamorous moment. Or the time a sudden storm threatened to ruin our entire corn crop, and we spent hours in the pouring rain, desperately trying to salvage what we could. But for every difficult moment, there were countless joyful ones. The first time I successfully baked a pie using apples from our own orchard, Ethan's face lit up with such pride you'd think I'd won a Michelin star. When I finally mastered driving the tractor, we celebrated with a picnic in the middle of the freshly plowed field. And nothing could beat the satisfaction of looking out at rows of vegetables we'd planted together, watching them grow day by day. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself changing in ways I never expected. My body grew stronger, more capable. I no longer flinched at the sight of mud or manure. I learned to appreciate the rhythm of the seasons, the satisfaction of hard work, the simple pleasure of a home-cooked meal made with ingredients we'd grown ourselves. But it wasn't just the physical changes. I found myself becoming more patient, more resilient. Problems that would have sent me into a tailspin in my old life now seemed manageable. When our ancient washing machine broke down, instead of calling a repairman or buying a new one, as I might have done before, Ethan and I spent an afternoon taking it apart and fixing it ourselves. The sense of accomplishment I felt when it whirred back to life was unlike anything I'd experienced in my corporate career. Our relationship deepened too. Ethan and I had always been close, but working side by side every day, facing challenges together, brought us even closer. We learned to communicate better, to support each other through the tough times and celebrate the good ones. Every night, no matter how exhausted we were, we'd sit on the porch swing, watching the sun set over the fields, talking about our day and our dreams for the future. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were times when I missed my old life acutely. A photo on social media of my friends at a glitzy New York gala would send a pang through my heart. Or I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection, hair tied back in a messy bun, face bare of makeup, clothes stained with who knows what, and for a moment, I wouldn't recognize myself. And then there was the silence from my father. After the wedding, he'd cut off all contact. No calls, no messages, not even a peep from his lawyers. At first, I was almost relieved. But as time passed, I found myself missing him, wishing he could see how happy I was, how much I'd grown. One day, about 6 months into our marriage, I found an old photo album while cleaning out a closet. In it was a picture of my dad and me at my college graduation. We were both smiling, his arm around my shoulders, looking for all the world like the perfect father-daughter duo. I sat on the floor, staring at that photo, a lump forming in my throat. Ethan found me there, tears silently rolling down my cheeks. Without a word, he sat down next to me, pulling me into his arms. We sat like that for a long time, him just holding me while I cried. "I miss him," I finally whispered. "I know," Ethan said, kissing the top of my head. "And that's okay. He's your dad. It's okay to miss him." We talked late into the night, about family, about forgiveness, about the complexities of love. Ethan shared stories about his own father, who had passed away when Ethan was in high school. "He wasn't perfect," Ethan said, "but he taught me that family is worth fighting for, even when it's hard." The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. I couldn't control my father's actions, but I could control my own. I decided to write him a letter, not expecting a response, but needing to reach out. As I sat at our kitchen table, pen in hand, I looked out the window at the farm. The morning sun was just peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, I could see Ethan already at work, his figure a silhouette against the brightening sky. I took a deep breath and began to write. "Dear Dad," I wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. I want you to know that I'm happy. Really, truly happy." As I poured my heart out onto the page, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Whatever happened, whether my father responded or not, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. This new life, with all its challenges and joys, had become more precious to me than all the luxury I'd left behind. And as I signed my name at the bottom of the letter, I smiled, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Life on the farm had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan and I had just celebrated our first wedding anniversary, marking a year of hard work, laughter, and love. I was finally feeling like I truly belonged in this world of early mornings, honest labor, and simple pleasures. But as I was about to learn, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. I was in the kitchen, up to my elbows in bread dough, when the phone rang. Wiping my hands on my apron, I answered, expecting it to be Mrs. Johnson from down the road asking about our fresh eggs. Instead, a crisp, professional voice greeted me. "Good morning, is this the Thompson residence? I'm calling for Mr. Ethan Thompson." Surprised, I replied, "Yes, this is the Thompson residence, but Ethan's out in the fields right now. Can I take a message?" The voice on the other end hesitated. "This is Mr. Blackwell from Blackwell and Associates law firm. It's quite urgent that I speak with Mr. Thompson. Could you ask him to call me back as soon as possible?" A lawyer. My mind raced. Had something happened? Was there a problem with the farm? "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll let him know right away." As soon as I hung up, I was out the door, practically running to the far field where I knew Ethan was working. I found him on the tractor, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. When he saw me approaching at a run, he immediately cut the engine, concern etched on his face. "Ava, what's wrong?" he asked, jumping down from the tractor. I caught my breath. A lawyer called. Mr. Blackwell from Blackwell and Associates. He said it was urgent. I expected to see worry or confusion on Ethan's face. Instead, there was a flash of, was that resignation? He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I guess it's time," he muttered, almost to himself. "Time for what?" I asked, my confusion growing. "Ethan, what's going on?" He took my hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with mine. "Let's go back to the house. I need to tell you something." The walk back to the farmhouse felt like the longest of my life. My mind was spinning with possibilities, each more worrying than the last. Had Ethan been in some kind of trouble before we met? Was there a problem with his family that he'd kept from me? Once we were seated at our kitchen table, mugs of hastily made coffee in front of us, Ethan took a deep breath. "Ava, there's something I should have told you a long time ago. I'm not just a simple farmer." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He sighed, his eyes meeting mine. "My grandmother, she wasn't just a farmer. She was Margaret Thompson." The name rang a bell, but I couldn't quite place it. "Should I know who that is?" A small, sad smile played on Ethan's lips. "She was one of the biggest names in agricultural technology. Founded Thompson Agritech. Ring any bells?" My jaw dropped. Thompson Agritech was a multi-billion-dollar company, known for revolutionizing farming practices across the country. But that would mean... Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I'm her heir. Or at least, one of them. When she passed away last year, she left me a significant portion of her estate." I felt like the room was spinning. "Last year? But that was before we even met. Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" He reached across the table, taking my hands in his. "I wanted to, Ava. So many times. But when we first met, you were so excited about leaving your old life behind, about living simply. And then, as we got closer, I was afraid. Afraid that if you knew, you might think I was just like the guys you left behind in New York." I pulled my hands away, standing up and pacing the kitchen. My mind was reeling. All this time, I thought I'd given up everything for love, for a simpler life. And now, to find out that Ethan had been keeping this enormous secret. So all of this, I gestured around the farmhouse, the hard work, the struggling to make ends meet sometimes. It was all for show? Ethan stood up, his face pained. "No, Ava, no. This farm, this life, it's real. It's who I am. My grandmother, she believed in hard work, in never forgetting your roots. She made me promise that I'd live on the farm for at least a year after her death, really experiencing the life of a farmer, before I could access my inheritance. I stopped pacing, turning to face him. "And that year is up now?" He nodded. "That's probably what the lawyer was calling about. To let me know I can now access the funds, take control of my part of the company." I sank back into my chair, feeling overwhelmed. "I don't understand, Ethan. Why keep working like this if you knew you had all that money coming?" Ethan knelt beside me, his eyes earnest. "Because this is the life I want, Ava. The money, the company, they're just things. This farm, our life together, that's what matters to me. I wanted to make sure you loved me for me, not for what I could give you." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Part of me understood his reasoning, but another part felt betrayed. "I left everything behind for you, Ethan. My family, my career, everything. Do you know how hard that was? And all this time, you had this secret." He hung his head. "I'm so sorry, Ava. I never meant to hurt you. I've seen what money can do to people. How it can change them. I didn't want that for us." We spent hours talking that day. Ethan told me everything about his grandmother, about growing up knowing he would one day inherit a fortune but being taught the value of hard work. He showed me old photos of him as a child, sitting on his grandmother's lap in board meetings, learning about the business even as he learned to read. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our kitchen, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my mind. "So what happens now?" Ethan took a deep breath. "That's up to us, Ava. We can keep living exactly as we have been. Or we can use this money to expand the farm, maybe start our own small business." Or, I prompted. "Or we could sell the farm, move to the city, live the kind of life you were used to. Whatever you want, Ava. I just want you to be happy." I looked around our small farmhouse. At the worn wooden table where we'd shared so many meals. At the muddy boots by the door, the fresh flowers Ethan brought in for me every week sitting in a mason jar on the counter. I thought about the past year, about how much I'd grown, how much we'd grown together. "Ethan," I said softly, "I am happy. Here, with you. This life we've built, it's more valuable to me than any fortune." Relief washed over his face. He pulled me into a tight hug, and I could feel his heart racing. "I love you so much, Ava. I promise, no more secrets." The next day, we drove into the city to meet with Mr. Blackwell. As we sat in his plush office, looking at documents detailing Ethan's inheritance, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It wasn't so long ago that I'd been in offices like this, discussing my own family's wealth. But this time was different. As Ethan and I discussed our options, our plans for the future, I realized that we had an opportunity here. Not just to be wealthy, but to do something meaningful with that wealth. "What if," I said, the idea forming as I spoke, "we used some of this money to help other small farmers? People who are struggling like we were, or thought we were." Ethan's face lit up. "Like a grant program? Or maybe low-interest loans?" Mr. Blackwell nodded approvingly. "That could be arranged. It would be a wonderful way to honor your grandmother's legacy, Ethan." As we left the office, plans swirling in our heads, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in a long time. We had the chance to make a real difference, to help people who were living the life we'd come to love so much. That night, back on the farm, Ethan and I sat on our porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. "You know," I said, leaning my head on his shoulder, "a year ago, I thought I was leaving wealth behind to find happiness. Turns out, I found both." Ethan chuckled, pulling me closer. "And I thought I had to hide my wealth to find true love. Guess we were both wrong." As we sat there, planning our future, I realized that the real wealth in my life wasn't in any bank account or stock portfolio. It was right here, in the love we shared, in the life we'd built together, and in the opportunity we now had to help others. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges. We had a lot to figure out, a lot of decisions to make. But as I looked out at the fields stretching before us, golden in the fading light, I knew that whatever came our way, we'd face it together. And that, more than any amount of money, made me feel like the richest woman in the world. The news of Ethan's inheritance spread like wildfire through our small town. At first, It was just whispers and curious glances when we went into town for supplies. But soon, it seemed like everyone knew that the humble Thompson farm was now home to one of the wealthiest young couples in the state. I was picking up our mail at the local post office when I overheard Mrs. Jenkins, the postmistress, gossiping with another customer. Can you believe it? All this time, young Ethan was sitting on a gold mine. And that city girl of his, giving up her fancy life for nothing. I cleared my throat loudly, and they both jumped, looking guilty. Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins, I said sweetly, accepting our stack of mail. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help adding, you know, some things are worth more than gold. But the real bombshell was yet to come. About a week after our meeting with Mr. Blackwell, I received a call I never expected. It was my father's secretary, informing me that he would be arriving at our farm the following day. No explanation, no asking if it was convenient. Just a statement of fact, delivered in a clipped, professional tone. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking slightly. Ethan found me standing in the kitchen, staring at nothing. Ava, what's wrong? My father, I managed to say. He's coming here. Tomorrow. Ethan's eyebrows shot up. Here? To the farm? I nodded, still trying to process it myself. I guess he must have heard about your inheritance. Ethan's face darkened. So now that he knows I have money, he suddenly wants to reconcile? I sighed, leaning into Ethan's embrace. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he's coming to gloat about how he was right all along about marrying for money. We spent that evening in a state of nervous anticipation. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, even though I knew my father would probably turn up his nose at our modest farmhouse no matter how spotless it was. Ethan busied himself in the barn, tinkering with the tractor engine long after the sun had set. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I stood on the porch, watching the dust cloud approach on the horizon. As it got closer, I could make out the sleek black shape of a luxury car, looking comically out of place on our dirt road. The car pulled up, and out stepped my father, looking exactly as I remembered him. Expensive suit, perfectly coiffed hair, an air of authority that seemed to command respect. But there was something different too. A tightness around his eyes, a slight slump to his shoulders that I'd never noticed before. Ava, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Dad, I replied, suddenly feeling like a little girl again. It's good to see you. He nodded, his eyes taking in the farmhouse, the fields beyond. So this is where you've been hiding. Before I could respond, Ethan appeared beside me. He put his arm around my waist, a gesture of support and solidarity. Mr. Sinclair, he said, his voice level. Welcome to our home. My father's eyes narrowed as he took in Ethan. Thompson, he said, a note of challenge in his voice. I hear congratulations are in order. Quite the inheritance you've come into. I felt Ethan stiffen beside me. The farm's been in my family for generations, sir. The inheritance doesn't change that. An awkward silence fell. Finally, I cleared my throat. Why don't we go inside? I've made some coffee. As we settled around our kitchen table, the contrast between my father's tailored suit and our rustic surroundings couldn't have been more stark. He looked uncomfortable, like a fish out of water. So, my father began, his fingers drumming on the table. You knew about this all along, didn't you, Ava? This was all some elaborate scheme? I felt a flash of anger. No, Dad. I didn't know. Ethan only told me recently. My father's eyebrows shot up. You expect me to believe that? That you gave up everything for this, he gestured around the kitchen, when you could have had it all along? Ethan leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. With all due respect, Mr. Sinclair, Ava didn't give up everything. She gained a life. A real life, not one dictated by social expectations and corporate pressures. My father scoffed. A real life. Milking cows and plowing fields. Yes, I interjected, surprising myself with the force in my voice. A life where I'm valued for who I am, not for my last name or my bank balance. A life where I've learned the value of hard work, of community, of true partnership. I reached out and took Ethan's hand. Money doesn't guarantee happiness, Dad. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to. For a moment, my father looked taken aback. Then his face hardened again. So what now? You've got your millions. Going to buy a penthouse in the city? Start jetting around the world? Ethan shook his head. No, sir. We're staying right here. We're going to use the money to help other small farmers, people who are struggling to keep their family farms afloat. My father laughed, but it was a hollow sound. You can't be serious. You have the chance to join the big leagues, and you're going to throw it away on charity. It's not throwing it away, I said quietly. It's investing in something that matters. In people, in communities. In preserving a way of life that's disappearing too fast. My father fell silent, his eyes moving between Ethan and me. For the first time, I saw something in his gaze that looked almost like respect. You really love it here, don't you? He asked, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years. I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes. I do, Dad. I'm happy here. Truly happy. He sighed, suddenly looking older than his years. I've made a lot of mistakes, Ava. Pushing you away, that was the biggest one. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unspoken words and missed opportunities. Ethan stood up, clearing his throat. I think I'll go check on the chickens. Give you two some time to talk. As he left, my father watched him go with a thoughtful expression. He's a good man, isn't he? I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. The best. For the next hour, my father and I talked. Really talked, in a way we hadn't since I was a little girl. He told me about the loneliness he'd felt since I left, how empty his life of luxury suddenly seemed without someone to share it with. I told him about my struggles and triumphs on the farm, about the joy I'd found in this simple life. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, my father stood up. I should be going, he said, a note of regret in his voice. I walked him to his car, Ethan rejoining us on the porch. My father turned to Ethan, extending his hand. Thompson. Ethan. I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly. Ethan shook his hand, a small smile on his face. Water under the bridge, sir. My father nodded, then turned to me. Ava, I'm proud of you. The woman you've become. I hope we can start over. Tears blurred my vision as I hugged him, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne. I'd like that, Dad. As we watched his car disappear down the dusty road, Ethan put his arm around me. You okay? I leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Yeah, I think I am. That evening, as Ethan and I sat on our porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. A year ago, I thought I was giving up everything for love. Now, I realized I had gained more than I ever could have imagined. You know, Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence, your dad's not so bad when he's not trying to buy you a husband. I laughed, playfully swatting his arm. He's trying. That's what matters. Ethan nodded, pulling me closer. So, Mrs. Thompson, ready to change the world, one farm at a time? I smiled, looking out at the fields that had become my home, my heart full of love and hope for the future. Absolutely, Mr. Thompson. Let's get to work. As the stars began to twinkle overhead, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. With love, with determination, and with the knowledge that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the difference you make in the world. The months following my father's visit were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan and I threw ourselves into our plans to use our newfound wealth to make a difference in the farming community. We started by setting up the Thompson Sinclair Agricultural Foundation, a name that brought together both our families and our shared vision. Our first project was close to home. Old Man Johnson, who owned the farm next door, had been struggling to keep his operation afloat. His equipment was outdated, and he couldn't afford the new irrigation system he desperately needed. When we approached him with an offer of help, he was skeptical at first. I don't take handouts, he grumbled, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. Ethan smiled, unfazed. It's not a handout, Mr. Johnson. It's an investment. In you, in this community, in the future of farming. We worked out a deal, low-interest loans for new equipment and infrastructure improvements, coupled with mentorship from experienced agricultural experts. Within months, Mr. Johnson's farm was thriving, his crops lusher than they'd been in years. Word spread quickly, and soon we were fielding requests from farmers all over the state. We set up workshops on sustainable farming practices, organized farmers' markets to help small producers reach more customers, and lobbied for policies that would protect family farms. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some people in town were resentful of our success, spreading rumors that we were trying to buy control of the whole area. Others thought we were foolish for not simply enjoying our wealth in luxury. One particularly difficult day, I overheard two women gossiping at the local diner. "Who do they think they are?" one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Playing at being farmers when they could be living it up in New York or LA. For a moment, I felt that old insecurity creep in. Were we doing the right thing? Then I remembered the look on Mr. Johnson's face when he saw his first bumper crop in years, the tears in a young farmer's eyes when we helped her save her family's legacy. I held my head high as I walked past the gossiping women, secure in the knowledge that we were exactly where we needed to be. Ethan and I worked tirelessly, often putting in 16-hour days. We were exhausted but exhilarated, watching our dreams take shape. And through it all, our love for each other and for this life we'd chosen only grew stronger. One evening, as we sat on our porch swing after a long day, Ethan turned to me with a mischievous glint in his eye. "You know, Mrs. Thompson, we never did have a proper honeymoon." I laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Are you suggesting we take a break?" He nodded, pulling me closer. "I think we've earned it, don't you? How about we take that trip to Italy you've always dreamed of?" The idea was tempting, but as I looked out over our fields, golden in the setting sun, I realized something. "You know what? I'm happy right here. This is where I want to be." Ethan's smile could have lit up the night sky. "Me too, sunshine. Me too." Instead of a lavish trip, we decided to take a week off and explore our own backyard. We went hiking in the nearby mountains, picnicked by hidden waterfalls, and spent lazy afternoons fishing in the local creek. It was simple, it was us, and it was perfect. As our foundation grew, so did our family. My relationship with my father continued to improve, albeit with some bumps along the way. He struggled to understand our commitment to this rural life, but he was trying, and that meant the world to me. One Sunday, about a year after his first visit, he showed up unannounced, looking uncharacteristically casual in jeans and a polo shirt. "I thought maybe you could use an extra pair of hands today," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Ethan and I exchanged surprised glances before breaking into grins. "Sure, Dad," I said, handing him a pair of work gloves. "We're harvesting tomatoes today. Think you can handle it?" What followed was one of the most surreal and wonderful days of my life. Watching my father, the man who once judged success solely by the size of one's bank account, working alongside us in the fields, his designer clothes stained with dirt and sweat, was a sight I never thought I'd see. By the end of the day, he was exhausted but grinning, his face red from the sun. "I had no idea," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "This work, it's not easy, but there's something satisfying about it." From that day on, my father became a regular visitor to the farm. He even started taking an interest in the foundation, offering business advice and leveraging his connections to help us expand our reach. Seeing him find purpose beyond the pursuit of wealth was a joy I hadn't known I needed. As our second wedding anniversary approached, Ethan and I sat down to reflect on how far we'd come and where we wanted to go next. Our foundation had helped dozens of farms, but we knew there was still so much more to do. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his face serious. "What if we expanded beyond just financial help? What if we set up a training program for young people who want to get into farming but don't know where to start?" The idea took root and grew. We partnered with the local community college to create a comprehensive agricultural program, combining classroom learning with hands-on experience. We opened up parts of our farm as a living classroom, and Ethan and I found ourselves in the unexpected role of teachers. Watching young, eager faces light up as they learned about soil composition, crop rotation, and sustainable practices reminded me of my own journey. I thought back to those first days on the farm, How overwhelmed and out of place I'd felt. Now, here I was, passing on the knowledge and love for this life that Ethan had given me. One crisp autumn morning, as I stood watching a group of students excitedly examining the progress of our experimental organic apple orchard, I felt a familiar pair of arms wrap around me from behind. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Thompson," Ethan murmured, resting his chin on my shoulder. I leaned back into him, a contented sigh escaping my lips. "Just thinking about how much has changed. How much we've changed." He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Having any regrets?" I turned in his arms, meeting his warm brown eyes. "Not a single one." "You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner," he said, leaning in for a kiss. As we stood there, surrounded by the fruits of our labor, both literal and figurative, I marveled at the journey that had brought us here. From a chance meeting in a corn maze to building a life and a legacy together, every step had led us to this moment. Later that evening, as we walked hand in hand through our fields, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Ethan suddenly stopped. He turned to me, a nervous energy about him that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Ava," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "there's something I need to ask you." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "How would you feel about expanding our family?" For a moment, I was stunned. Then, a warmth spread through me, a joy so intense it brought tears to my eyes. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Ethan nodded, a hopeful smile on his face. "I think it's time, don't you? To bring a little Thompson into the world." I threw my arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," I whispered. 1,000 times yes. As we stood there, holding each other close, our future stretching out before us full of promise and possibility, I knew that this was just the beginning of our greatest adventure yet. We had redefined success on our own terms, created a life rich in love and purpose, and now we were ready to share that with a new generation. The sun dipped below the horizon, the first stars twinkling to life in the darkening sky. Ethan took my hand, and together we walked back towards our home, towards our future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever joys and sorrows we might face, we would face them together, rooted in the love and life we had built on this land. As we reached our porch, I paused for a moment, looking back at the fields stretching out behind us. I thought about the girl I had been, the woman I had become, and the mother I hoped to be. I thought about the legacy we were building, not of wealth or status, but of love, community, and stewardship of the land. "Ready for this new chapter?" Ethan asked, squeezing my hand. I smiled up at him, my heart full. "With you. I'm ready for anything." And as we stepped into our home, I knew that whatever the future held, we had already found our happily ever after, right here on this farm, in the life we had chosen and the love we shared.